90% of the large mammals that once inhabited the European landscape have vanished in a span of only 150 years. This mass disappearance has triggered a slow but relentless collapse of entire ecosystems, leading to the compaction of soil and a total breakdown of local biodiversity. Natural ecological cycles that had functioned without interruption for thousands of years are now falling apart across the continent. Why can bringing back a vanished species restart an entire system in decline? It seems obvious that planting more trees should solve the crisis of a dying forest. But the fundamental problem did not lie within the canopy itself, as the missing elements were the complex ecological links that once kept the entire landscape functioning. Europe attempted every possible conservation strategy over the decades, yet the grand ambition to restore ancient forests to their former glory never became a reality. One can notice how the ground remains hard and the undergrowth stays stagnant without the presence of large herbivores. The process of restoration is only gaining momentum. To save a failing ecosystem, simply adding more trees is often not enough to trigger a recovery. At first glance, the task of reviving the wilderness appeared impossible, but in reality, the solution emerged from a species that had been officially declared extinct in the wild more than 100 years ago. Everything only gets more complicated as scientists attempt to reintroduce these heavy animals to the modern environment. The equipment gradually records the movements of these reintroduced herds as they begin to break up the compacted earth with their weight. It is visible how the soil softens under their hooves, allowing dormant seeds to finally sprout after years of suppression. This interaction creates a cascade of biological activity that no human intervention could replicate. Therefore, the focus of environmental engineering shifted from passive protection to active rewilding. This transition to the next level of conservation relies on the physical impact of these animals on the terrain. The restoration moves forward as the missing biological connections are re-established one by one. Thus, the recovery of the natural world begins with the return of its most vital architects. The ecosystem starts a new chapter of stability as the ancient cycles find their rhythm once again. 1919 was the year the final wild European bison perished. No ceremony marked this event, and no observer realized at the time that this specific moment represented the total disappearance of the largest land mammal on the continent from its natural environment. It is difficult to comprehend this loss, given that only a few centuries prior, these animals occupied vast territories spanning from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia and from the Atlantic coast to the Caspian Sea. Historical estimates suggest their population once reached hundreds of thousands or even millions of individuals across the European plains. Why did such a dominant species vanish so rapidly from the wild? It is often assumed that modern warfare was the primary cause, but the decline actually began much earlier. While humans had hunted bison for food since the hunter-gatherer era, the critical turning point was the systematic expansion of agricultural land. Overhunting and large-scale deforestation acted in tandem to collapse the natural habitat of the bison over several hundred years. The species was not eradicated in a single catastrophic event, but was instead slowly suffocated by the steady progression of human civilization. One can notice how the landscape changed as forests were cleared to make way for permanent settlements and farms. By the beginning of the 20th century, many conservationists believed the fate of the bison was already sealed. A species that had successfully survived the Ice Age and thousands of years of extreme climatic shifts could not survive 100 years of modern human activity. At that time, fewer than 50 European bison remained in existence, and all of them were held in captivity. The process of decline only gained momentum from this point. World War I erupted as a final devastating blow to a population that was already balancing on the very edge of total extinction. Amidst the chaos of military occupation, the animals were hunted relentlessly for their meat, hides, and horns. It seems simple to blame the war alone, but in reality, the conflict merely accelerated a process that had been decades in the making. After the conclusion of the war, only 2 small isolated herds remained in the wild. 9 individuals survived within the Białowieża forest, located in eastern Poland, yet they were hunted until the very last wild bison in that region was killed in 1921. The second herd sought refuge in the remote and rugged mountains of the Western Caucasus. However, 6 years later, poachers located and shot the final individual in that territory. The European bison was officially declared extinct in the wild, leaving only the captive individuals as the final representatives of their lineage. This event concluded the era of the bison as a free-roaming inhabitant of the European wilderness. 800 kilograms is the approximate weight of a mature European bison, a mass comparable to a compact car, yet these creatures once stood taller than an adult human. Why did such massive animals possess the ability to move at speeds 3 times faster than a person can run? This physiological paradox allowed them to leap over significant obstacles that appeared insurmountable for their heavy frames. At first glance, such immense physical power and speed can be intimidating to any observer. But in reality, bison are calm herbivores that prioritize the avoidance of conflict over any form of aggression. In the majority of encounters, the animal chooses a calculated retreat rather than engaging in a direct confrontation. This specific blend of colossal size and a gentle temperament established the bison as one of the least dangerous large mammals within its natural ecosystem. It gets more complex further on. Unlike the American bison, which developed a preference for vast and open grasslands, the European species evolved within the shelter of dense forests and mixed landscapes. One can notice how they move with surprising grace between thick timber and natural clearings. The animals graze on various grasses while simultaneously browsing on shrubs and the tender bark of young branches. This feeding behavior is precisely what defines them as ecosystem engineers, as they actively rebuild the environment from the ground up through their daily movements. They do not merely inhabit these spaces, they directly shape the topography by opening up closed forest canopies and restarting biological cycles that had previously stalled. The process is only gaining momentum. Where bison populations exist, many other species begin to recover in a synchronized chain reaction. Protecting the bison is not simply an act of saving a single isolated species, but a method of safeguarding the entire web of life that revolves around their presence. It is visible how their foraging habits create a complex, mosaic-like landscape. Within this environment, open patches of earth, young shrubbery, and mature vegetation interweave to form a specialized habitat. This structural diversity enables a vast number of plant and animal species to flourish rapidly in the wake of the herd. For example, the bison create essential space for flowering shrubs to grow within the deep forest, which immediately attracts diverse insect populations. These insects, in turn, draw in various birds and small mammals, creating cascading effects that spread outward through the territory. It seems simple, but this is a profound ecological paradox where the largest animals create the specific physical conditions that allow the smallest organisms to survive. Biodiversity is not a collection of independent entities, but a tightly interconnected system of biological dependencies. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the historical trajectory of the species. Notably, the point where the European and American bison species intersect is not found in their physical form or their specific habitats, but in the similar fate they both faced. When the available space for a species disappears, even the largest and most powerful creatures are erased from history. The material reality of their survival depends entirely on the preservation of the landscape they once engineered. Thus ends one of the key chapters in the study of these massive ecosystem engineers. 50 individuals were all that remained of the entire species when the bison vanished from their natural wild habitats. This minuscule number carried a heavy genetic crisis that threatened the future of the population. Why did such a small group pose a terminal risk to the survival of these animals? It seems simple to assume that a few survivors could rebuild a population, but in reality, an extremely limited gene pool meant that inbreeding was no longer a theoretical risk, but an absolute technical inevitability. Scientists observed the situation with grim predictions. Many experts believed that even if the bison did not face immediate extinction, the population would gradually weaken through successive generations. One can notice how reproductive capacity would diminish until the species simply disappeared in silence. But this is just the beginning of a desperate intervention. A small group of dedicated conservationists refused to accept this silent erasure of a species. Polish zoologist Jan Stoltzman led the movement by calling for urgent and immediate technical action. He was not alone in this endeavor. Heinz Heck, who served as the director of the Munich Zoo, joined the effort alongside his brother Lutz Heck, the director of the Berlin Zoo. Together, they began the complex task of coordinating the movement of the remaining animals. The process is only gaining momentum as they gathered every survivor from various zoos and private reserves across the continent. They founded the International Society for the Protection of the European Bison to formalize their preservation efforts. At the International Nature Conservation Conference held in Paris in the year 1923, they presented a comprehensive plan for recovery. It only looks obvious now, but at the time, this was a pioneering step in biological management. By the year 1932, the European Bison Pedigree Book was officially established. Every single individual was meticulously recorded within these technical ledgers. The equipment of the era was pen and paper, but the methodology was precise, controlling every single breeding decision to prevent a total genetic collapse. One can notice how the records tracked lineage to maximize diversity. The central question was not merely whether the species would survive the century. Transition to the next level of the debate focused on the fundamental nature of the animal. It remained to be seen if the bison would exist as a truly wild entity or remain a permanently managed population under human supervision. The survival of the species reached a stable but controlled plateau. 1929 was the year the first European bison were finally released back into the wild. This momentous event took place in the Białowieża forest, which served as a location of deep historical irony rather than a symbolic coincidence. This was the exact territory where the very last wild bison had been killed just years prior, marking the point where the species had vanished from the earth. Why did the recovery of the population start in the very place of its destruction? One might think that a different, safer environment would be chosen for such a fragile experiment, but the deep, primeval thickets of Białowieża offered the only ecosystem capable of supporting the return of these massive herbivores to their ancestral lands. The population grew at a slow but steady pace over the following decades. One can notice how the herds gradually expanded from this single point into other major forest massifs across Poland. As the number of bison rose into the hundreds, the scale of the recovery shifted. But this is just the beginning. An unavoidable question emerged as the population reached significant levels. Could these animals truly return to a completely wild state after so much time in captivity? Many scientists objected to the optimism of the reintroduction programs. At first glance, the recovery seemed like a success, but in reality, serious doubts remained about the instincts of the animals. Could a species that had lived for multiple generations behind fences and under human protection still remember how to survive without intervention? It gets more complex further on. The answer to this fundamental biological uncertainty lay in Romania, specifically within the Tarcu Mountains. This region represents one of the last remaining truly wild landscapes in Europe, characterized by steep terrain and unpredictable weather patterns. The equipment of the researchers monitors these slopes where the bison must now prove their resilience. If the bison could not survive in the harsh conditions of the Tarcu range, they would not survive anywhere in the modern world. The process is only gaining momentum as more individuals are brought into these high-altitude environments. It is visible how the animals navigate the rocky slopes, searching for forage beneath the snow as their ancestors once did. This transition to the next level of rewilding is the ultimate test of the species. From here, the transformation of the bison from a zoo exhibit back into a keystone predator-prey participant moves to the next phase of ecological history. 180,000 hectares of old-growth forests, river valleys, and alpine grasslands define the vast landscape of the Tarcu Mountains. Why was this specific region chosen for the reintroduction of an extinct species? It would seem any mountainous terrain could suffice for large herbivores. But only the complex ecosystem of the Romanian Carpathians offered the specific biodiversity required to sustain the European bison after an absence of more than 200 years. On May 17, 2014, the first 17 bison returned to the wild. The process is only gaining momentum. Engineers and researchers constructed a 15-hectare acclimatization enclosure to serve as a protective transition zone for the initial herd. This secure perimeter allowed for the constant monitoring of animal health and social behavior while serving as a physical barrier against the threat of poaching. At first glance, the reintroduction seemed like a calculated success, but in reality, the early years were defined by brutal environmental resistance. Harsh winters claimed the lives of weaker individuals who were unable to adapt to the plummeting temperatures and deep snow. One can notice how the camera glides along the frozen slopes, where predators frequently targeted the vulnerable calves of the first generation. Within the enclosure, hierarchical relationships shifted constantly, leading to internal conflicts and high levels of stress among the herd members. It gets more complex further on. Learned behavior began to emerge among the animals born specifically within the wild. These younger bison carried no memory of captivity or human intervention. It is visible how the herd gradually began to read the physical landscape, identifying natural corridors to avoid danger, and moving in synchronization with the seasonal rhythm of the forest. After a period of 2 years, the first herd was granted full release into the unprotected wilderness. Subsequent reintroductions took place in 2018 to bolster the existing population. One can notice the slow movement of the heavy gates as more animals transitioned into the forest. Not every individual release achieved total success, yet each stage provided researchers with critical data and increased operational experience. This iterative process built the necessary confidence that the bison could eventually sustain their own population without human oversight. The animals now move deeper into the mountain range, reclaiming their historical role in the ecosystem. The material of the herd continues to grow and adapt to the Carpathian environment. From here, the transformation of the landscape moves to the next phase of natural restoration without haste. 100 individuals was the census reached by the European bison living in total freedom within the Tarcu Mountains by 2021. Why is this relatively small number of animals considered a definitive success for conservation? One might assume that thousands of individuals are required to secure a future, but in reality, this group proved the existence of a self-sustaining population capable of surviving without human intervention. These bison expanded their range across more than 200 square kilometers, moving far past the boundaries of the initial release zones. No fences or barriers restricted their movement. The animals determined their own territory based on seasonal needs and resource availability. This behavior serves as a critical indicator that the species has successfully reclaimed its original ecological role as a landscape engineer. It is visible how the presence of bison produces immediate and measurable changes in the environment. In the specific areas where they established residency, the richness of plant species increased by approximately 30%. Monotonous, dense forests were gradually broken apart by the weight and feeding habits of the herd. They are replaced by mosaic landscapes where grasses, shrubs, and stands of young timber coexist in a natural balance. One can notice how bison dust bathing pits act as miniature reservoirs that retain rainwater during dry spells. Their dung provides a concentrated source of nutrients that enriches the soil, while their thick winter fur traps seeds, carrying them across distances of tens of kilometers. The process is only gaining momentum. No human hands coordinated these ecological shifts, and no administrative orders were issued to the wildlife. Bison do not technically restore nature through conscious effort. Instead, they trigger natural processes that allow the environment to repair itself. But the Tarcu Mountains, located in a small corner of the Carpathians, do not represent an isolated incident of success. 10 years after the initial reintroduction efforts, consolidated data from the European Bison Pedigree Book and the International Union for Conservation of Nature showed a return on a continental scale. Poland and Belarus now serve as the primary strongholds, hosting the largest populations of European bison on the planet. Each of these two nations provides a habitat for more than 2,000 individuals. These herds are not merely historical remnants confined to the ancient Białowieża forest. Instead, they function as vital source centers that provide the genetic stock for most rewilding projects currently active across the European continent. It gets more complex further on. Beyond these primary hubs, the species has successfully reappeared in a diverse array of countries including Germany, the Netherlands, France, and Denmark. Populations are also established in Spain, Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Russia, as well as throughout the Balkan states. According to the data updated in 2024, Poland alone serves as a home to approximately 2,800 European bison. Such a massive recovery would have been considered a biological impossibility during the early 20th century. These growing populations reveal a fundamental truth about the resilience of the species. Bison are not only returning to the most remote and wildest locations remaining in Europe, they are gradually reclaiming landscapes that were once believed to be permanently closed to the presence of large wild animals. The metal and concrete of modern infrastructure are proving to be surmountable obstacles as the species expands. From these central hubs, the movement of the animals continues into new territories. Thus, the bison population reaches a state of stability that allows for further expansion across the continent. 9,000 individuals is the total population that the European bison has reached today across the entire continent, having descended from just over 50 surviving specimens. This return of a species from the very edge of extinction did not occur in a social vacuum, as the physical presence of such large animals immediately triggered concerns within local communities. Farmers worried about the potential for crop damage, while broader questions regarding public safety began to emerge among residents. Why is rewilding considered a process of negotiation rather than a purely ecological endeavor? At first glance, the task seems to be about biology, but in reality, the integration of wildlife into human-dominated landscapes requires constant diplomatic balancing. Without this negotiation, the tension between nature and infrastructure leads to inevitable conflict. Some time ago, a single male bison traveled a greater distance than any recorded individual before him. One can notice the immense physical power of the animal as he swam across the Oder River and crossed the Polish-German border. This movement marked the first time a free-ranging bison had entered that territory in more than a century. But this is just the beginning. What could have served as a powerful symbol of a returning European wilderness instead concluded in immediate tragedy. Within a matter of hours, local German authorities, driven by fear and systemic uncertainty, made the decision to shoot the animal. That story exposed an uncomfortable truth regarding modern conservation. While the act of poaching still exists in the deep forests, the primary threat to the bison is no longer the hunter, but the friction between wildlife and the ways humans utilize the land. This is the reason why conservation efforts cannot simply stop at the physical release of animals into the wild. Rewilding organizations find themselves forced to establish dedicated compensation funds and train specialized local guides. The process is only gaining momentum as these groups open direct channels of dialogue with the surrounding communities. In reality, the amount of recorded damage caused by the animals remains statistically low. But fear does not disappear through the presentation of data alone, as the lack of familiarity with large herbivores creates a persistent psychological barrier. It seems simple to manage a species, but the sad truth is that humans have forgotten how to share landscapes with large wild animals. One can notice how the equipment of modern agriculture and the sprawl of settlements leave little room for such giants. Therefore, adaptation must occur on both sides of the boundary. Humans need to overcome deep-seated fears and work to understand the gentle nature of the bison, along with the vital ecological services they provide to the soil and vegetation. At the same time, the bison themselves must be supported in learning how to move safely through a continent that is increasingly fragmented by fences and roads. It gets more complex further on. A new form of economic value has begun to emerge from this uneasy coexistence. Bison-centered ecotourism now generates approximately €2 million per year for the region. One can notice how guest houses, restaurants, and guiding services have gradually developed to support this influx of visitors. Local crafts have also seen a resurgence as the animal becomes a focal point of regional identity. Not every inhabitant benefits from this shift equally, but for the first time in many decades, wild nature is no longer viewed solely as an obstacle to industrial development. It has transitioned into a functional part of the local economy. And this is not the limit. How much physical space does Europe still have left for large animals? This question is harder to answer than any previous technical challenge in the conservation program. Roads, intensive agriculture, and even the infrastructure for renewable energy all compete for the same limited territory. Rewilding is not an attempt to turn back time to a pristine, untouched version of the continent. Instead, it is a difficult process of redistributing space where no single option comes without some degree of pain. Pulling a species back from the brink of extinction is an extraordinary achievement that serves as a blueprint for rewilding other large species. Everything only gets more complicated as the population grows. If nature truly returns to its former habitats, how far are humans actually willing to step back to accommodate it? The past 10 years have only provided enough time to begin asking that question with the seriousness it requires. The story of the bison continues as the animals move deeper into the modern landscape. Thus ends one of the key stages of the European bison recovery.